The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Yankee Stadium as Frank DeMarco adjusted his worn Yankees cap and took a slow sip of his overpriced beer. At 68, he'd been coming to this ballpark for over 50 years, first as a kid with his own father, then bringing his son Michael, and now sitting in the bleachers with his 15-year-old grandson Tyler. The traditions that had connected 3 generations of DeMarco men were playing out once again on this warm September afternoon. But something felt different today. Frank could sense the distance growing between himself and Tyler, a gap that seemed to widen with each passing month as his grandson grew more interested in video games, social media, and the fast-paced world that left old men like Frank feeling increasingly irrelevant. "Grandpa, why do we have to sit so far from the action?" Tyler complained, his attention divided between the game and his phone. "Dad would have gotten us better seats." Frank bit back his first response, which was that his son Michael was too busy with his law practice to spend an afternoon at the ballpark, despite Frank's repeated invitations. Instead, he pointed toward the field, where Aaron Judge was stepping into the batter's box. "These are good seats, Tyler. You can see the whole game from here, understand the strategy. When I was your age, I'd have been thrilled to sit anywhere in Yankee Stadium." Tyler rolled his eyes with the casual cruelty that only teenagers could master. "That was like 50 years ago, Grandpa. Everything's different now. Baseball's not really for old men anyway. It's too slow." The words hit Frank harder than they should have. He dedicated his life to this team, this sport, this ritual of fathers and sons gathering to watch America's pastime. He had a collection of ticket stubs dating back to the 1960s, could recite statistics from decades of Yankees seasons, and had passed down stories of Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra like family heirlooms. "Not for old men," Frank repeated quietly, his weathered hands gripping his beer a little tighter. "I mean, no offense," Tyler continued, his eyes still on his phone, "but it's just so boring. 3 hours of mostly nothing happening, and all these old guys acting like it matters so much." He gestured vaguely around the stadium, where grey-haired fans were indeed prominent among the crowd. Frank looked around and realized Tyler wasn't entirely wrong. The demographics of baseball had been shifting for years, with younger fans drawn to faster-paced sports and shorter attention spans struggling with the deliberate rhythm of baseball. But to Frank, that rhythm was exactly what made the game beautiful, the way it unfolded like a conversation, the strategic depth that revealed itself over 9 innings, the connection to history that stretched back over a century. "Your dad used to love coming here with me," Frank said, trying to bridge the generational gap. "He'd bring his glove, hoping to catch a foul ball. He knew every player's batting average." "Yeah, well, Dad's old too now," Tyler replied with the brutal honesty of youth. "And he's always too busy working to do anything fun anyway." The comment stung because it contained more truth than Frank wanted to acknowledge. Michael had indeed grown distant from the family traditions that had once bound them together. The law practice consumed most of his time, and when he did have free moments, he spent them on golf courses or business dinners rather than at ballparks with his father and son. Frank had been hoping that this afternoon would recapture some of the magic he'd shared with Michael 30 years ago, but Tyler's disinterest was making it clear that those days might be gone forever. The boy checked his phone constantly, complained about the pace of the game, and seemed to view the entire experience as something he was enduring rather than enjoying. "Tell you what," Frank said, making one more attempt to engage his grandson. "Why don't we walk around the stadium during the 7th inning stretch? I'll show you Monument Park, tell you some stories about the great players who've worn these pinstripes." Tyler shrugged without looking up from his phone. "If you want to, Grandpa. But I already know about all that stuff from Wikipedia." Frank felt something deflate inside his chest. Wikipedia. As if the accumulated stories and memories of a lifetime could be reduced to a few paragraphs on a website. As if the feeling of watching Don Mattingly's swing or Derek Jeter's clutch hitting could be captured in statistics and bullet points. It was then that the announcement came over the stadium's public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for today's 50-50 raffle drawing. The winning ticket holder will receive $2.5 million, with an additional $2.5 million going to the Yankees Foundation for youth baseball programs. Frank absently reached into his pocket and pulled out the raffle ticket he'd purchased when they'd entered the stadium. It was something he did at every game, a $5 donation that supported youth baseball while giving him a slim chance at winning what was usually a few $1,000s. Today's jackpot was unusually large, probably due to the weekend crowd and the team's position in the playoff race. The announcer began reading the winning numbers. 7, 4, 9, 2, 1, 6. Frank looked down at his ticket. 749216. He blinked and looked again, certain he'd misread the numbers. But there they were, exactly matching what the announcer had called out. Frank DeMarco, retired postal worker from the Bronx, had just won $5 million. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" Tyler asked, finally looking up from his phone as he noticed Frank's stunned expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank held up the ticket with shaking hands. I think I just won the raffle." Tyler glanced at the ticket dismissively. "Yeah, right. What did you win? Like $50? $2.5 million, Frank said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. Tyler's phone slipped from his hands, clattering to the concrete floor of the bleachers. "What did you say?" "The raffle. I won. $2.5 million. Other fans around them had overheard, and word was spreading quickly through their section. People were turning to stare, some pulling out their phones to record the moment, others calling out congratulations. Frank felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but more than that, he was struggling to process what had just happened. At 68 years old, after a lifetime of modest living on a postal worker's pension, Frank DeMarco had become a millionaire while watching his beloved Yankees on a September afternoon. "Grandpa," Tyler said, his voice filled with awe and disbelief, "are you serious? You really won?" Frank nodded, still staring at the ticket as if it might disappear if he looked away. "I need to go claim this." They said to report to the customer service office. Tyler was suddenly completely engaged, his phone forgotten as the magnitude of the moment hit him. "This is incredible. Grandpa, you're rich. You're actually rich." As they made their way through the crowds toward the administrative offices, Frank's mind was racing. $5 million would change everything: his modest apartment in the Bronx, his careful budgeting on a fixed income, his worries about leaving something meaningful to his family. But more immediately, it would change the dynamic of this day, this relationship with his grandson, this conversation about baseball being a game for old men. Tyler was practically bouncing with excitement, suddenly full of questions about what Frank would do with the money, whether he'd buy a new house, whether he'd get better season tickets. The boy who had been bored and dismissive an hour earlier was now looking at his grandfather with new eyes, not as an irrelevant old man, but as someone who had just experienced something extraordinary. Frank smiled as they walked through the stadium corridors, realizing that in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. Tyler was right about one thing. Baseball wasn't for old men. Sometimes baseball was for millionaires. The customer service office at Yankee Stadium had never handled a winner quite like Frank DeMarco. The staff, accustomed to dealing with complaints about overpriced concessions and requests for lost and found items, suddenly found themselves coordinating with lottery officials, legal representatives, and security personnel as word of the massive raffle win spread throughout the organization. Frank sat in a comfortable chair, still clutching his winning ticket, while Tyler paced the small office with nervous energy. The boy's entire demeanor had transformed, Gone was the sullen teenager checking his phone, replaced by an animated young man who couldn't stop talking about the possibilities that had suddenly opened up. Grandpa, with $5 million, you could buy season tickets right behind home plate, or you could buy a box. You could watch every game in luxury. Frank smiled at his grandson's enthusiasm, but he was also thinking about more practical matters. The lottery official, a serious woman named Patricia Chen, was explaining the process of claiming such a large prize, the tax implications, the payment options, the security considerations that came with sudden wealth. Mr. DeMarco, Patricia explained, you have several options for how to receive your winnings. You can take the full amount in annual payments over 20 years, or you can take a lump sum of approximately $3.2 million after taxes. What would you recommend? Frank asked, still struggling to believe this was really happening. That depends on your financial goals and personal situation. Many winners prefer the lump sum because it gives them immediate access to the money and eliminates the risk of payment issues down the road. Tyler leaned forward eagerly. Take the lump sum, Grandpa. Think about what you could do with $3 million right now. Frank held up a hand to quiet his grandson, recognizing that he needed to think carefully about this decision. At 68, he probably had 15 or 20 good years left, and this money could transform not just his own life, but his family's future. I'd like to speak with my son before making any final decisions, Frank said, and probably a financial advisor. Of course, Patricia replied. We can arrange for you to work with some reputable financial planning firms that specialize in lottery winners. In the meantime, we'll need you to sign some preliminary paperwork and arrange for secure storage of the winning ticket. As they worked through the initial bureaucracy, Frank found himself thinking about Tyler's comment that baseball wasn't for old men. The irony wasn't lost on him. His grandson had dismissed the relevance of older fans just hours before his grandfather had won more money than most people earned in a lifetime, all while enjoying the supposedly outdated pastime of baseball. Tyler, Frank said during a break in the paperwork, I want you to call your father. Tell him we need to talk tonight. Tyler pulled out his phone eagerly. Should I tell him about the money? Just tell him it's important. I want to explain this in person. Tyler made the call, and Frank could hear his son's voice on the other end, distracted, probably in the middle of something work-related, initially reluctant to commit to an evening meeting. But something in Tyler's tone must have conveyed the urgency, because Michael eventually agreed to meet them at Frank's apartment later that evening. By the time they left Yankee Stadium, the game was in the 9th inning and the Yankees were winning, but Frank had missed most of the action while dealing with his sudden change in circumstances. As they walked to his old Honda Civic in the parking lot, Tyler was already making plans. Grandpa, you should definitely get a new car. Something really nice, a Mercedes maybe, or a BMW. Frank unlocked the Civic, which had served him faithfully for 12 years, despite Tyler's obvious embarrassment about its dented fenders and faded paint. This car runs fine, Tyler. It gets me where I need to go. But you can afford anything now. Why settle for this old thing when you could have the best? Frank started the engine and considered his grandson's question. Why settle for less when you could afford more? It was a reasonable question. But Frank had spent his entire adult life finding satisfaction in modest pleasures and practical choices. The idea of sudden extravagance felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. As they drove through the Bronx toward Frank's apartment, Tyler continued planning ways to spend the money. Better seats at Yankees games, luxury vacations, a bigger apartment in a nicer neighborhood, expensive restaurants, designer clothes. Each suggestion reflected the boy's assumption that having money meant spending money, that wealth was valuable primarily for the lifestyle upgrades it could purchase. Frank listened to his grandson's enthusiasm, but he was thinking about different possibilities. $3 million could provide security for his retirement, yes, but it could also create opportunities for his family. Tyler could attend any college he wanted without worrying about student loans. Michael could reduce his crushing work schedule if he wanted to. Frank could support causes that mattered to him, help friends and neighbors who were struggling, make a real difference in his community. "Tyler," Frank said as they pulled into his apartment complex, "what would you do if you suddenly had more money than you ever expected?" Tyler didn't hesitate. "I'd buy everything I always wanted but couldn't afford. The newest iPhone, a gaming computer, maybe a car when I turn 16. I'd travel, go to concerts, eat at fancy restaurants. I'd basically do whatever I wanted." Frank nodded, understanding that Tyler's response was perfectly natural for a 15-year-old who had never experienced financial insecurity. But Frank had grown up during harder times, had worked for everything he owned, had learned to find happiness in simple pleasures rather than expensive acquisitions. "What about you, Grandpa?" Tyler asked as they climbed the stairs to Frank's second-floor apartment. "What are you going to do?" Frank unlocked his door and looked around the modest space that had been his home for 15 years. The furniture was old but comfortable. The decorations were mostly family photos and Yankees memorabilia, and everything was clean and organized in the way of someone who took pride in maintaining what he had. "I'm going to think very carefully about how to use this gift responsibly," Frank said. "Money like this is an opportunity to make good choices, not just expensive ones." Tyler flopped onto the couch, still buzzing with excitement. "But you'll get some cool stuff too, right? I mean, what's the point of having money if you don't enjoy it?" Frank smiled at his grandson's perspective. "Oh, I'll enjoy it, Tyler. But maybe not in the way you're thinking." They spent the next hour calling Frank's sister Rose, his longtime friend from the post office, and a few other family members and close friends. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: disbelief, excitement, congratulations, and immediate suggestions for how to spend the money. Frank found himself repeating the same response. He was grateful, overwhelmed, and planning to be very thoughtful about his next steps. When Michael arrived at 7 o'clock, he looked tired and slightly irritated, clearly fitting this family obligation into an already packed schedule. Tyler had managed to keep the secret, so Michael had no idea why he'd been summoned for an urgent family meeting. "Dad, what's this about?" Michael asked, settling into a chair and checking his watch. "I have a client call at 8:30. Frank looked at his son, successful, driven, but somehow diminished by the constant pressure of his career, and felt a mixture of love and sadness. When had Michael become so focused on work that spending an evening with his family felt like an imposition? "Michael," Frank said quietly, "this afternoon at the Yankees game, something happened that's going to change our lives." He pulled out the winning lottery ticket and explained what had occurred, watching his son's expression shift from skepticism to amazement to something that looked almost like relief. $5 million, Michael repeated, as if testing the words to see if they were real. $2.5 million to me, $2.5 million to the Yankees Foundation, Frank clarified. After taxes, probably around $3 million. Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Frank could see his son's lawyer mind working through the practical considerations: tax strategies, estate planning, investment options. "Dad, this is incredible," Michael said finally. "Do you realize what this means? You'll never have to worry about money again. You can move to a nicer place, travel, live comfortably for the rest of your life." "What about you?" Frank asked. "What does it mean for you?" Michael looked confused by the question. "For me, Dad, it's your money. I'm just happy that you won't have to stress about finances anymore." Tyler, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, finally burst out, Dad, don't you get it? Grandpa can help with my college, maybe help you with the practice. We could all do things we've never been able to afford. Frank watched his son and grandson, seeing two different perspectives on what wealth could mean for a family. Tyler saw endless possibilities for new experiences and material improvements. Michael saw financial security and the elimination of economic stress. Both were valid viewpoints, but Frank was beginning to understand that he had a third perspective: the opportunity to strengthen the connections between three generations of DeMarco men who had somehow drifted apart despite loving each other deeply. "There's something I want to tell you both," Frank said, gathering his thoughts. "Tyler, this afternoon you said that baseball wasn't for old men. You made me feel like the things I cared about were irrelevant, outdated, not worth your time." Tyler looked uncomfortable, probably regretting his earlier words now that his grandfather had become a millionaire. "But here's what I learned today," Frank continued. "Sometimes old men have surprises left in them. Sometimes the things that seem boring or outdated turn out to be more valuable than anyone expected. And sometimes, if you're patient enough to stick around for the whole game, you might see something extraordinary happen." Michael and Tyler both looked at Frank with new attention, sensing that this was about more than just lottery winnings. "This money is a gift," Frank said, "but the real gift is the chance it gives us to reconnect as a family. To remember that we're more than just three people going through the motions of being related to each other." Frank looked at his son and grandson, two people he loved deeply, but who had somehow become strangers to the traditions and values that had shaped his life. "So, here's what I propose," Frank said. "Before we make any big decisions about this money, we're going to spend some time together, real time, not just an afternoon at a baseball game where half of us are checking phones and the other half are feeling irrelevant. Time where we actually talk to each other, learn about each other, and figure out what kind of family we want to be now that we have this opportunity." Tyler and Michael exchanged glances, both probably wondering what Frank had in mind. "Because you're right, Tyler," Frank continued with a smile. "Baseball isn't for old men, it's for families, and we're about to find out what that really means." The financial advisor's office in Midtown Manhattan was everything Frank had expected. Expensive furniture, impressive views, and an atmosphere designed to convey competence and discretion. Margaret Steinberg had been recommended by the lottery officials as someone who specialized in helping sudden wealth recipients navigate their new circumstances, and Frank had agreed to meet with her before making any major decisions about his winnings. But he hadn't expected her first question. "Mr. DeMarco, before we discuss investment strategies or tax implications, I'd like to understand what this money means to you. What are your goals? What kind of life do you want this wealth to enable?" Frank glanced at Michael and Tyler, who had accompanied him to the meeting. His son was taking notes in a legal pad, approaching the discussion with his usual systematic thoroughness. His grandson was fidgeting with barely contained excitement, probably imagining all the ways $3 million could transform their lives. "I want to be smart about it," Frank said carefully. "I don't want to waste this opportunity." "That's admirable," Margaret replied, "but it doesn't really answer my question. Some of my clients want to preserve wealth for future generations. Others want to maximize their own lifestyle improvements. Some focus on charitable giving. There's no right answer, but understanding your priorities will help us develop an appropriate strategy." Frank had been thinking about this question for 3 days, ever since the surreal moment when his raffle ticket had transformed him from a retiree living on a modest pension to a multimillionaire. The answer had crystallized during his conversations with Michael and Tyler as he'd watched their different reactions to the sudden wealth. "I want to use this money to bring my family back together," Frank said. "We've drifted apart over the years, gotten busy with our own lives, stopped making time for the things that connect us." This money gives us a chance to change that. Margaret nodded approvingly. Family wealth can be a powerful tool for strengthening relationships when it's approached thoughtfully. What specific changes are you considering? Frank looked at Michael, whose law practice had consumed his life for the past decade, leaving little time for family relationships or personal interests. My son works too hard. He's successful, but he's missing out on watching his son grow up, just like I missed out on parts of his childhood because I was working so much. Dad, Michael protested, I have responsibilities. I can't just cut back on work because you won some money. Why not? Frank asked simply. What if this money could give you the freedom to make different choices? What if you could reduce your caseload, hire more associates, take time to coach Tyler's baseball team, or teach him to drive, or just have dinner together more than once a month? Michael was quiet, clearly struggling with the idea that his father's windfall could affect his own life choices. It's not that simple, Dad. I have clients depending on me, office expenses, professional obligations. And what about family obligations? Frank interrupted gently. Tyler, when's the last time your father took you somewhere just for fun? Not because it was a holiday or special occasion, but just because he wanted to spend time with you. Tyler thought for a moment, his expression growing uncomfortable. I don't know. It's been a while. Margaret had been watching this exchange with professional interest. Mr. DeMarco, it sounds like you're considering using your wealth to create experiences and opportunities for your family rather than just accumulating assets or purchasing luxury items. Exactly, Frank said. I've been thinking about this wrong from the beginning. This isn't about me becoming rich. It's about us becoming a real family again. Over the next hour, they discussed practical strategies for achieving Frank's goals. A portion of the money would be invested conservatively to ensure Frank's own financial security for the rest of his life. Another portion would fund an education trust for Tyler, guaranteeing that he could attend any college he chose without financial constraints. But the most innovative part of Margaret's proposal involved creating what she called a family experience fund. Instead of just giving money to your family members, Margaret explained, you could use a portion of your winnings to create shared experiences that bring you together. Travel, activities, projects that require collaboration and communication. Like what? Tyler asked, his interest clearly piqued. Margaret smiled. That depends on what interests your family. Some of my clients have funded family businesses, sponsored trips to places their ancestors came from, or created foundations that require family members to work together on charitable projects. Frank felt a spark of excitement as he considered the possibilities. What if we planned a trip to Italy? My grandparents came from Sicily, but none of us have ever been there. We could trace our family history, see where the DeMarcos came from. Tyler's eyes lit up. That would be awesome. I've never been to Europe. I don't know, Dad, Michael said, ever practical. That kind of trip would take weeks. I'm not sure I could get away for that long. What if you could? Frank asked. What if the money gave you the freedom to hire enough help in your practice that you could take a month off without worrying about your clients or your income? Margaret nodded approvingly. Family wealth is most meaningful when it creates opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. A month-long trip to Italy, with the financial resources to really explore your heritage and spend quality time together, could be transformative for your relationships. They spent another hour discussing practical details, trust structures, tax implications, estate planning considerations. But Frank found himself most energized by the conversation about experiences and relationships. For the first time since winning the lottery, he could envision a future that was about more than just having money. After the meeting, they walked through Central Park on their way back to Frank's car. Tyler was full of questions about the Italy trip. asking about ancient ruins and Italian food and whether they could attend a soccer match while they were there. Michael was quieter, clearly processing the financial implications of what they'd discussed. "Dad," Michael said as they paused near the baseball fields where several pickup games were in progress, "I want you to know that I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not sure it's realistic for me to just step away from my practice for a month." Frank watched a father teaching his young son to catch fly balls, noting the patience and attention the man gave to each throw, each word of encouragement. "Michael, when Tyler graduates from high school and goes to college, how much time will you have had to really know him as a person? To understand what he cares about, what he dreams about, what kind of man he's becoming?" Michael followed his father's gaze to the baseball field, where the father and son were completely absorbed in their simple game of catch. "I know I work too much, but that work provides for our family, gives Tyler opportunities." "Money provides opportunities," Frank interrupted, "but relationships provide meaning. And right now, we have enough money to create opportunities for relationships that we've never had before." Tyler had wandered over to watch the pickup games, drawn by the sight of kids his own age playing baseball with obvious enjoyment. Frank noticed that his grandson wasn't checking his phone, wasn't complaining about the pace of the game, wasn't dismissing the activity as something for old men. "Look at him," Frank said to Michael. "When's the last time you've seen Tyler that engaged with anything that didn't involve a screen?" Michael watched his son, cheering for a good play by kids he'd never met, his face animated with genuine enthusiasm. "It has been a while," he admitted. "Tyler!" Frank called out. "Want to show these kids how a DeMarco swings a bat?" Tyler jogged over with a grin. "Can I, Dad? They're looking for another player." Michael checked his watch instinctively, probably calculating how long they could stay before his next conference call or client meeting. But then he looked at Tyler's hopeful expression and made a decision that surprised Frank. "Sure," Michael said, "but only if your grandfather and I can play too." Iyad. For the next hour, 3 generations of DeMarco men played pickup baseball in Central Park with a group of strangers who didn't care about anyone's net worth or professional obligations. Frank played first base with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to compensate for an aging body. Michael surprised everyone, including himself, by remembering how to turn a double play. Tyler discovered that his athletic skills translated well to baseball, despite his earlier complaints about the sport being boring. "Grandpa," Tyler said as they walked back to the car, grass stains on his clothes and a satisfied tiredness in his voice. "That was really fun. I forgot how much I used to like playing baseball." "When did you used to play?" Frank asked. "When I was little. Dad used to take me to the park and we'd play catch, before he got so busy with work." Frank glanced at Michael, who was looking at his son with an expression of surprise and regret. "I remember those days," Michael said quietly. "You had a pretty good arm, even when you were 7 years old." "You think we could do that again sometime?" Tyler asked, his question directed at both his father and grandfather. "Actually," Frank said, "I have an idea about that. What if we planned our Italy trip around the baseball season? We could catch some games in the Italian Professional League, maybe visit some of the places where American players have gone to play overseas." Tyler's enthusiasm was immediate. "They have professional baseball in Italy." "They do," Frank confirmed, "and Sicily has some beautiful old stadiums where they've been playing for decades." Michael was quiet for a moment, then smiled in a way Frank hadn't seen in years. "You know, that actually sounds like something worth taking time off for." As they drove back to the Bronx, Frank reflected on the afternoon's revelations. Tyler had rediscovered his enjoyment of baseball when it wasn't being presented as a tedious obligation. Michael had remembered how much he enjoyed playing with his son when work pressures weren't dominating his thoughts. And Frank had learned that his lottery winnings were most valuable not for what they could buy, but for what they could create. time, experiences, and opportunities for his family to know each other as people rather than just as relatives going through the motions. "Grandpa," Tyler said from the back seat as they pulled into Frank's apartment complex, "I owe you an apology. What I said about baseball being for old men was really stupid." "Why was it stupid?" Frank asked, genuinely curious about his grandson's change of perspective. "Because the age doesn't matter. What matters is whether people are doing it together, whether they care about each other and want to have fun. Today was the most fun I've had in months, and it was because we were all actually paying attention to each other instead of just going through the motions." Frank smiled, understanding that Tyler had learned something important about the difference between activities and experiences, between spending time together and actually connecting. "Besides," Tyler continued with a grin, "any game where you can win $5 million is definitely worth paying attention to." Frank laughed, realizing that his grandson was absolutely right. Baseball wasn't for old men or young men or any particular demographic. It was for people who understood that the best things in life, whether they were relationships, experiences, or unexpected windfalls, came to those who were patient enough to appreciate the whole game. 6 months later, Frank DeMarco stood on the observation deck of Mount Etna in Sicily, watching his son and grandson explore the ancient volcanic landscape with the enthusiasm of tourists who had finally learned to travel together rather than simply in each other's company. The 3-week trip to Italy had exceeded even Frank's optimistic expectations, transforming what could have been an expensive vacation into a genuine journey of family rediscovery. "Grandpa, look at this," Tyler called out, pointing his camera toward the smoking crater. "Can you believe our ancestors lived in the shadow of an active volcano?" Frank joined his grandson at the railing, marveling at the view that stretched across Sicily to the Mediterranean Sea. They'd spent the past week tracing the DeMarco family history through small towns and church records, discovering stories of resilience and determination that had shaped their family's character long before they'd ever heard of America or baseball. "Pretty impressive, isn't it?" Michael said, appearing beside them with a relaxed smile that had become more common as the trip progressed. "I never realized how much courage it must have taken to leave all this behind and start over in a new country." The transformation in Michael had been the most dramatic change of the entire trip. Away from his law practice, his constant phone calls, and his self-imposed pressure to be always productive, Frank's son had rediscovered parts of his personality that had been buried under years of professional obligations. He laughed more easily, asked questions about things that interested him rather than just things that affected his work, and most importantly, he'd learned to be present in conversations with his family. "Dad," Tyler said, using the formal camera Frank had bought him in Rome, "stand next to Grandpa so I can get a picture with the volcano behind you." As Tyler positioned them for the shot, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The lottery money had made the trip possible, but the real transformation had begun weeks before they'd left New York, as they'd planned the itinerary together and learned to prioritize shared experiences over individual preferences. Michael had indeed taken a month away from his practice, hiring 2 associate attorneys and restructuring his client relationships to allow for extended absences. The financial cushion provided by Frank's winnings had made this possible, but more importantly, it had given Michael permission to value family time as something more than just a luxury to be scheduled around work obligations. Tyler had initially been disappointed to learn that the trip wouldn't include luxury hotels and expensive restaurants, but Frank had insisted on staying in small, family-run establishments where they could meet local people and experience authentic Italian culture. The boy who had once dismissed baseball as boring had become fascinated by the stories of Italian immigrants who had brought their love of the game to America while adapting to a new culture. "You know what's funny?" Tyler said as they made their way back down the mountain. I thought this trip was going to be mostly about seeing old buildings and eating weird food, but it's actually taught me more about who we are as a family than anything we've ever done. What do you mean? Frank asked, though he had his own ideas about what Tyler had discovered. Like, I always knew you and Dad were different generations with different interests, Tyler explained. But I never understood that we were all connected to something bigger, this whole history of people who worked hard and took care of each other and didn't give up when things got difficult. Michael nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I've been thinking about. All those stories we heard in Palermo about great-great-grandfather building houses with his hands, about great-grandmother running a business while raising 6 children, it makes me realize that our family has always been about more than just individual success. They spent that evening in a small restaurant in Catania, sharing a meal of local specialties, while Frank told stories about his own father's immigration experience and the traditions that had been passed down through 3 generations of DeMarco men. But unlike the formal dinners they'd shared in New York, this conversation flowed naturally, with each person contributing memories and asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity about the other's perspectives. Grandpa, Tyler said over dessert, I've been thinking about what you said back in New York, about the lottery money being a gift that could bring us together. I think I understand now what you meant. Tell me, Frank said, genuinely interested in his grandson's insights. Well, before this trip we were like 3 people who happened to be related but didn't really know each other. Dad was always working, I was always on my phone or playing games, and you were, I don't know, kind of lonely, I think. Frank felt a pang of recognition at Tyler's observation. He had been lonely, more than he'd wanted to admit to himself. But the money didn't just buy us this trip, Tyler continued. It bought us time to actually pay attention to each other. And once we started doing that, we realized we actually like each other, not just love each other because we're family. Michael reached across the table and squeezed his son's shoulder. That's pretty wise for a 15-year-old. I learned it from you guys, Tyler replied with a grin. Turns out old men actually know some useful stuff. Frank laughed, remembering his grandson's comment about baseball not being for old men. So what changed your mind about that? Tyler considered the question seriously. I think I was confusing old with boring. But you're not boring, Grandpa. You've got all these amazing stories and experiences. And Dad's not boring either. He's actually really funny when he's not stressed about work. I just never took the time to find that out before. The conversation was interrupted by Tyler's phone, buzzing with a message. Frank watched as his grandson glanced at the screen, then deliberately turned the phone face down without responding. Not important? Frank asked. It's just friends asking what I'm doing, Tyler said. But I'm doing something way more interesting than anything I could text them about. They wouldn't understand anyway. Frank felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the Italian wine they'd been sharing. 6 months ago, Tyler would have spent the entire dinner answering texts and checking social media. The fact that he was choosing to be present in their conversation represented a fundamental shift in his priorities. Over the next week, they attended 2 Italian baseball games, visited the small town where Frank's grandfather had been born, and spent an afternoon learning to make pasta from an elderly woman who had known distant DeMarco relatives. Each experience added another layer to their understanding of their family's story and their own connections to each other. The baseball games were particularly meaningful for Frank. The Italian crowds approached the sport with a passion and knowledge that reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with the game as a child. Tyler was amazed by how seriously the Italian fans took every play, and Michael found himself genuinely enjoying the strategic elements of the game when he wasn't distracted by work concerns. You know what I realize now? Tyler said during the 7th inning stretch of a game in Palermo. Baseball isn't slow. I was slow. I wasn't paying attention to what was actually happening. Frank smiled, understanding that Tyler was talking about more than just baseball. On their final evening in Italy, they sat on the terrace of their hotel in Rome, sharing a bottle of wine. Tyler was allowed small sips, and reflecting on what they'd learned during their 3 weeks together. "Dad," Michael said, "I want you to know that this trip has changed how I think about everything. My work, my priorities, what I want Tyler to remember about his childhood." "How so?" Frank asked. "I spent so many years thinking that being a good father meant working hard to provide for Tyler's future, but I was missing his present. And I was missing my own present too. All the daily moments that actually make life meaningful." Michael paused, looking out over the lights of Rome. "When we get back to New York, I'm going to restructure my practice permanently. Not just for a month-long vacation, but for a better balance between work and family." Tyler looked up from the postcards he was writing to his friends. "Really? You mean like you'll actually be home for dinner sometimes?" "More than sometimes," Michael promised. "And Tyler, I want you to think about playing baseball again. Maybe we could find a league where you could play and I could coach." Tyler's face lit up. "You'd want to coach?" "I'd love to coach. I used to be pretty good at baseball before I convinced myself that work was more important than everything else." Frank listened to this exchange with deep satisfaction, understanding that the money he'd won at Yankee Stadium had purchased something far more valuable than luxury or security. It had bought his family the time and space to rediscover what mattered most to them. "There's something I want to tell you both," Frank said, as their conversation began to wind down. "This lottery win taught me that sometimes the things that seem like coincidences are actually opportunities. Tyler, if you hadn't come to that Yankees game with me, even reluctantly, I probably wouldn't have bought a raffle ticket. Michael, if you hadn't been too busy to come with us, the afternoon might have played out completely differently." Frank raised his wineglass in a toast. "So here's to the idea that everything happens for a reason, and sometimes the reason is to remind us what we already have but haven't been paying attention to." They clinked glasses as the sun set over Rome, 3 generations of DeMarco men who had traveled halfway around the world to discover that they actually enjoyed each other's company. The flight back to New York was bittersweet. They were eager to return home and begin implementing the changes they'd discussed, but reluctant to end an experience that had been so transformative for all of them. "Grandpa," Tyler said as their plane descended toward JFK Airport, "I have an idea for what we should do with some of the lottery money." "What's that?" "I think we should start a foundation that helps other families take trips like this. Like families who can't afford to travel together, but who might benefit from having that kind of time to reconnect." Frank looked at his grandson with surprise and pride. "That's a wonderful idea, Tyler. What made you think of it?" "Well, we're not the only family that's gotten busy and drifted apart, and we're probably not the only family that could be happier if they had the chance to really spend time together without all the usual distractions." Michael nodded enthusiastically. "I could help with the legal structure. We could partner with organizations that work with families in transition, divorce recovery, grief counseling, that kind of thing." Frank felt tears welling up in his eyes as he realized that his grandson had not only learned the lessons of their trip, but was already thinking about how to share those lessons with others. 3 months later, the DeMarco Family Foundation awarded its first grants to 5 families for week-long trips designed to strengthen relationships and create shared experiences. Frank served as president, Michael handled the legal aspects pro bono, and Tyler designed the application process and helped interview potential recipients. The foundation operated out of a small office near Yankee Stadium, and Frank made it a tradition to attend every Yankees home game with Tyler and Michael, who had indeed restructured his practice to allow for regular family time. Tyler had joined a local baseball league where Michael served as an assistant coach, and their dinner conversations were filled with discussions of strategy, teamwork, and the parallels between baseball and life. "You know what's funny?" Tyler said one evening as they walked home from a Yankees game where they'd watched from the same bleacher seats where Frank had won the lottery. "That day when I said baseball wasn't for old men, I was completely wrong." "How so?" Frank asked, though he thought he knew what Tyler meant. "Baseball isn't for old men or young men," Tyler said. "It's for people who understand that the best things in life take time to develop, and that paying attention to the details is what makes the difference between just going through the motions and actually experiencing something meaningful." Frank smiled, realizing that his grandson had learned the most important lesson of all, that whether you were talking about baseball, family relationships, or unexpected windfalls, the real value wasn't in the immediate excitement, but in the long-term appreciation of what you'd been given. "Besides," Tyler added with a grin, "any sport where a 68-year-old man can win $5 million is definitely worth taking seriously." Frank laughed, understanding that Tyler was absolutely right. Baseball, like family, like life itself, wasn't about age or expectations or conventional wisdom. It was about showing up, paying attention, and being ready for the unexpected moments when everything could change. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those moments happened while you were sitting in the bleachers at Yankee Stadium with the people you loved most, learning that the best things in life were worth waiting for. A year after winning the lottery, Frank DeMarco was still driving his 12-year-old Honda Civic, still living in his modest Bronx apartment, and still buying $5 raffle tickets at Yankees games. But he was also the happiest he'd been in decades, surrounded by a family that had learned to value presence over productivity, experiences over acquisitions, and each other over everything else. The money had been nice, but the real jackpot had been discovering that it was never too late to learn what really mattered.